Good evening, everyone. I would now like to call the Economic Development and Small Business Committee public hearing on the tax incentive policy and proposed amendments to order. My name is Jaiza Page, and I am joined this afternoon with President Pro Tem Michael Stenziano and Councilmember Elizabeth Brown, who are all members of the Economic Development and Small Business Committee. And I thank you both for attending. The purpose of this public hearing is to review amendments to proposed legislation to overhaul the tax incentives currently offered by the City of Columbus. The legislation was written based on a study released by HR&A and public feedback from a series of public meetings hosted by Columbus City Council under the leadership of Councilmember Elizabeth Brown. The study provided data regarding the city's use of tax incentives to support and encourage commercial, industrial, and residential development. On Wednesday, June 20th, Council convened a hearing to review the legislation, and today's hearing will cover proposed amendments to this legislation based on feedback from the initial hearing. And I would now like to ask Director Shoney, who is with us this afternoon, to briefly discuss the proposed tax incentive policy. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Chair Page, President Pro Tem Stenziano, Councilmember Brown, Councilmember Tyson. Thank you all, and Council President Hardin. Thank you all for the opportunity to speak to you again. As I stated in our first hearing, this policy is really intended to move us away from an incentive policy that was strictly focused on two things. One is encouraging more development in neighborhoods that had traditionally been disinvested at the time when the incentives for those areas were put in place. And second was encouraging job growth and really making it a much more nuanced policy, one that's focused not only on those two goals, but ensuring that we are doing what we can to encourage, through the incentive policy, mixed income neighborhoods and the provision of affordable housing that all of our residents can afford, and so that residents can have better options for choosing where they live and choosing to live close to where they work. The incentive policy doesn't get us all the way there. It is a step. It's a step I'm very proud that we're on the verge of taking with your help and your support. It's been a long path, but it's a path that we've taken very deliberately. We started over a year ago down this path. We hired an expert out of New York, HR&A consultants, as well as a local data team to help us come up with a system that is data-driven, that's based on the facts on the ground, but is also one that is not static. It is a system that has built-in reevaluations in it every 3 years. We plan on using those and being very purposeful about using that 3-year period so that this doesn't become simply another static point in time that we don't adjust to the market, but we've really tried to build a system, an incentive system for our property tax incentives that is one that will change as the city changes. So thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for all of your hard work and all the work of all the council members, in particular Councilmember Brown, who started down this path with us when she was chair of the committee. So thank you.
Thank you, Director. And again, thank you, President Hardin and Councilmember Tyson, for joining us this afternoon. Are there any initial questions or comments for the Director? Seeing none, I would now like to move into the section where each of my colleagues who have proposed amendments will discuss them briefly and also direct any questions that they may have to the Director. And many of these amendments come from us listening to the community, individuals who have reached out to our different offices and trying to address the questions that they've had as best as we can. And the current draft is available on your website, correct, Director? And that's on the columbus.gov under the Department of Development. And you're able to view it now if you have a smartphone with you or a tablet or anything with Wi-Fi access. And of course, if not, you're able to view that at home. And again, the amendments that we are proposing are amendments to that draft that is currently available. The first amendment for discussion this evening is a timeline extension and permit requirements. Initially, all applicable approvals for the following list, this is how the legislation currently reads, that they must have been obtained on or before July 31st of 2018. However, after talking to individuals who plan to do new development projects within the city and the timeline, I would like to propose that this be extended to September 30th, 2018. And the approvals that would be required are any historic, architectural, design review body approvals for all project elements, and then any required approvals from City Council or the Board of Zoning Adjustment. Applicants must also obtain all necessary building permits, including having their final site compliance submitted and reviewed, and foundation permit approval on or before December 31st of 2018. We have added, or are proposing to add, that no extension will be given for an expiring foundation permit. So we are proposing that no extension will be given for any permit that expires after December 31st of 2018. And lastly, any applicant must obtain a final certificate of occupancy on or before December 31st, 2020, or within a reasonable period of time thereafter, as determined by the development director. Again, we listened to the comments and concerns from our partners and constituents, and I believe that extending this deadline will allow for a more conducive transition to adhere to the new policy. Again, this legislation will be on for our second reading on July 30th. The initial timeline would have ended that on July 31st, and I would propose that we extend that again to September. Are there any questions or concerns from my colleagues regarding the timeline extension and permit requirements? President Pro Tem Stenziano.
Thanks, Madam Chair. And I don't know if maybe the director would know. Do we have a sense of how many projects this could be? I know one that maybe could have fallen has taken that one out of the pool. Just curious, so the public is aware, kind of in that transparency, how many we may be thinking could fall into this. And I get the reason for the extension is we didn't get the legislation until a little later than we thought. And so trying to, again, go through our process and make sure we have a smooth transition.
Thank you, President Pro Tem Stenziano, Chair Page, President Hardin, members of council. My guess is, and we don't have anything that would officially tell us that, my guess is there may be 2 or 3, maybe 4. I will also plead first day back from being out of the office for a week in terms of not having an exact answer on that, and I probably should have asked the question myself before coming in today. That said, realistically, probably 3, at most 4 that I've heard about that it might be an issue, and a lot of those being kind of small projects that are being done. You know, maybe a single-family homeowner doing a carriage house on the back, kind of a project. Some of those kinds of things.
Thank you. And Director, could you talk briefly about the department's efforts to make sure that the larger community, particularly developers, were aware of this legislation and the proposed timelines?
Thank you, Chair Page. We did a series of 4 community outreach sessions where we explained the policy starting almost exactly, I guess it'll be a year ago next month. And then in early October, I believe it was October 4th of last year, we did a outreach session specifically targeted to developers. In that session in particular, we indicated that this was the direction we were going and that folks should be trying to move their projects forward because we would need to have a transition period. When we came out with our detailed recommendations in, I believe it was late April, we put forward the timeline that we were planning on recommending, which was the July 31st timeline. So that has been out there for a while. That said, to the earlier point, the drafting of this legislation, the evaluation of the legislation is a very complex and, not to use a term I used earlier, but nuanced discussion. And I believe that, you know, I understand why council has taken, and appreciate that council has taken such a detailed and deliberative approach to this legislation because it is very complex and it is potentially transformative. So we put our timeline out there. We tried to make everyone aware, but then again, it's also hard for folks to adjust when they don't know what the final legislation is going to be until so late.
Thank you, Director. I would now like to hand the floor over to Councilmember Elizabeth Brown to discuss her proposed amendments.
Thank you so much, Chair Page. I'm going to be talking about 2 amendments and the general subject matter of in lieu of payments that developers will pay differently based on whether it's an opportunity, revitalization, or market-ready area. So the in lieu of payments for developers in market-ready area, current language reads that a project sponsor is required to make an annual payment for the duration of the abatement in lieu of providing affordable housing units if they decide they don't want to provide those units. And these payments are made to the Affordable Housing Trust. The current rate in the legislation for this annual payment is 125% of the difference between the rent of the units built versus the rent of those units if those units were affordable under the 80% and 100% AMI threshold. We are proposing to increase this amount to 150% of the difference. So this essentially increases the penalty for developers who choose not to build affordable units under these guidelines. We believe that this in lieu of fee will help will help move the ball forward overall for our affordable housing goals, to capture those built into projects that are underway, and then to capture if developers choose to forego, they pay a fee that then is captured into affordable housing goals. The next amendment is very similar, except it is in the ready for revitalization areas. The project sponsor can currently choose to make a one-time payment of $2,500 in lieu of the affordable unit. For example, if a new development has 100 housing units, 20 of them are required to be affordable at 80% or 100% of area median income under these guidelines. If the project sponsor, again, as written in this example, does not build the affordable units, they would be required to make a one-time payment of $50,000. This money would go to a local CDC to support affordable housing, so a local community development corporation. We're proposing to increase this one-time payment essentially to double it to $5,000 per unit. This goal is the same. We want affordable units to be built, and if they are not, we want the payments to go towards accomplishing those affordable housing goals. I want to highlight that sort of underpinning all of this is where those affordable units would be built with any money that's captured from these fees. In the case of CDCs, community development corporations, if the payment goes to them in the ready for revitalization areas, the affordable housing will happen in that same neighborhood, maybe even in the same block, because CDCs develop locally. With the Affordable Housing Trust, one thing that we heard public comment on, that we heard much agreement from council members on, is that we wanted, whenever possible, for dollars captured under these fees to be reinvested into that area. And so the department worked with the Affordable Housing Trust to ensure that that will be their policy in every possible case. So I don't know if you want to elaborate on that, Director Shoney, or if it's sufficed in an explanation. I do think that people on this council probably are curious about that and may have their own questions. So you could talk now, or we could save it for if there are questions, whatever you prefer.
Thank you, Councilmember Brown. President Hardin, members of council, as you know, I'm always happy to talk. A couple of comments. One is the purpose in having the in lieu of fees is not, I want to be clear, it is not our desire to actually ever see those in lieu of fees paid. Our desire is to see mixed income housing built in the neighborhoods where new housing is going up. That said, there does come a point at which you say if someone is willing to pay a premium in order to obtain the abatement over and above the value that we would have gotten just on a pure calculation of how much that affordable housing is worth, if somebody's willing to pay half again as much, that they're willing to pay that premium, at some point you have to ask yourself, is it in the city's interest, is it in the interest of our residents to collect that revenue and go out and find other ways to provide that housing? And whether it's 125% or 150%, I believe that's a good bargain for the city and the city's residents to make that premium on the value of our investment through the incentive. And it will always be our desire to see that housing, that affordable housing, developed in the neighborhood from whence the money was generated. I will be clear, there may be instances in which we look at it and say, with this amount of dollars, we can achieve this many more units in this other neighborhood. And so I'm not going to promise to you that in every case that money will be used back in the neighborhood. I want the flexibility for us to be opportunistic in how we make sure that we can provide affordable housing for our residents. But it will be our policy and our desire to have it be the default that it will go back into those neighborhoods. That's on the market-ready neighborhoods. On the ready for revitalization neighborhoods, where we've increased the fee there, the structure is that the default will be for those payments to go to an existing community development organization to either build more units in those neighborhoods, but also another alternative is to preserve and improve the affordable housing that already exists in those neighborhoods. There's a lot of what is sometimes called naturally occurring affordable housing in those neighborhoods. As neighborhoods become attractive again, as they see more investment, that naturally occurring affordable housing disappears. And so some of what this money may be used for is not necessarily the development of new affordable housing, but it may be used to go out and buy affordable housing that already exists in the neighborhood and make it affordable for the long term. So one of the things we heard as we did our outreach sessions is you go into neighborhoods, and I think the Near East Side is a great example. We heard from residents and activists on the Near East Side that yes, affordable housing is important, and yes, there has been a lot of affordable housing generated, new affordable housing built on the Near East Side, and maybe what they need is not more new affordable housing, but preserving and improving the affordable housing that already exists in that neighborhood. Same kind of conversations on the South Side. So we are setting this up in a way that has the flexibility to be able to accomplish both of those goals, and just as importantly, helps to build the capacity of those organizations to not only use these dollars that may be generated through this program, but then by doing more projects, you generate the ability to do projects with other money as well.
That's helpful, Director. Thank you. And that's all I have, Chair Page.
Thank you, Councilmember Brown. President Harden.
Thank you, Chair Page and Chair Brown. To reiterate your point, though, I think it's this council's hope, and sounds like the administration, that we don't see a big flush of resources coming into those funds. Is there a point, or will we set up some type of evaluation that if we see that folks are choosing to opt out, that you will work with this council to, how do we know that this number is the number that would encourage or dissuade folks from just opting out, when in reality we want people to build affordable housing?
One of the things that I'm happy about in terms of how we've designed the legislation is that we will be coming back to council. The administration will be coming back to council every 3 years with evaluations of how we've drawn, how each neighborhood is classified. We'll have to be coming back to council to report on the program. It's kind of an action forcing event for everyone to take a look back at the program. So that's in there all the time. We will be coming back to council to talk about the program every 3 years, which is a reasonable time to be able to evaluate. If we did it every year, the sample size will be just frankly too small. Waiting 5 years is too long. At some point, you just draw a line and say, okay, 3 years is probably the right amount of time. It's about how long it takes projects to get done from idea to fast-moving projects to get from idea to kind of actually getting out of the ground and starting to lease. It's a time period that makes sense, and so there is that action forcing event that will have us coming back to the council.
Thank you, President Harden. Now I'd like to hand the floor to President Pro Tem Stenziano to discuss his proposed amendments.
Thank you, Chair Page. On the every 3 year piece, when I was reading the legislation, can you point me where that is in the draft or the proposal? Because what I see is 1 year prior to expiration of an area's designation. And so the director makes that determination, and then if there are changes, then it's brought forward. What assurances do we have that we will always, every 3 years, have that dialogue or that discussion or kind of that point in time check? I know we had talked about it previously, and I appreciated kind of the willingness to understand for that. And I just got the updated draft the other day, so I haven't been able to pore over it, probably like you have. And so just wanting to touch base on, maybe not a date certain, but again, as Council President was alluding to, how we have that assurance of that ongoing commitment to work with us to make sure we're doing those kind of point-in-time checks.
Thank you, President Pro Tem. I don't have myself exactly where it is in the legislation. I can either have somebody, I'm sure Hannah's checking in the back right now, to be able to give you a specific answer on that, or I can follow up with you later and we can talk through how that is there. I can tell you from a practical standpoint, because we have to do the evaluation on the neighborhoods, and they will change over time, and particularly after the first 3 years, our plan is to reevaluate, and we've already started looking at what it would take to reevaluate how the maps are drawn. We will be back before you in 3 years.
Thank you. Can I have a follow-up? And to that point, and one item that we've discussed, you received, and the council received a letter from the Franklinton Area Commission, and just would be helpful to kind of be on the record in terms of why their request to split East and West Franklinton, how that fits within current draft proposal, and why maybe the 3-year time period would be the better opportunity to kind of do that point in time change. But what, and rather than drafting an amendment, kind of the explanation for why the department and maybe council, when it's presented to us, don't feel splitting East and West Franklinton is the right procedure to implement today.
Thank you, President Pro Tem, for the question. The determination of how we draw the maps, plural, for the various abatement areas is something we believe deserves its own level of time and scrutiny to really understand the implications of what we're doing. It was something that we struggled with, frankly, and I know I've had conversations with each of the members about where and when we should do that evaluation, given the complexity of the legislation and the desire to move forward now and craft this first step now. We felt it was more important to start moving forward than to go through the process of figuring out how to split neighborhoods. It sounds easy to say, well, let's draw it at 315, but it's more complex than that, because you have to determine, okay, on what boundaries can we get reliable data? What does it take to get the reliable data? And then also, frankly, I struggle with doing that for one of the abatement areas and not taking the time to do a full evaluation of each of the abatement areas and determine, are each of the, are there areas that we've left out? Are there areas that should be included? So our determination at the end of the day, our judgment call, was that the best path forward, the best recommendation to this council is to move forward with the abatement areas as we have them drawn, but know that a top priority is for looking at where are those abatement area maps correct and where are they incorrect, and let's make corrections to them next time we come back to council with a set of, with an evaluation of the program.
And then one more, Chair. To follow up from Councilwoman Brown's comment on the in lieu, I think what we've heard a lot of concern about, and I'm going to use Betty James's term, which she may be testifying, that those payments in lieu of will go to different pockets of the city and still continue to concentrate low-income housing, and instead of kind of making sure that it's the entire city is having that opportunity. And I know we're hearing policy, but not putting it in the language if we have in lieu. I also know in some of the discussion is, you're right, we probably can get more bang for our buck if we go to different areas and maybe not keep it within its own zip code. When you're going to be making that determination, can you explain any of those factors or just what's available, just so there's a little more assurances that this isn't a smoke and mirror, that we are trying to do that concentration. I think the council is committed to making sure we do and work with the department to make sure if an lieu ever gets paid, it goes to those neighborhoods that would have had it but for. Any clarification on that would be appreciated.
Thank you for the question. We're still formulating exactly where we're going with this. I can tell you some of the factors that will come in to play are how many units can we buy the affordability for what period of time if we keep it in the neighborhood that we're looking at. How much development is there going on in the neighborhood that we're looking at? So I think the Short North is a great example. Are we coming in and trying to buy more units in a neighborhood that is not seeing any more development going? If you're doing that, then you're going to be paying a huge premium to accomplish that. Are we better off than looking at a neighborhood that maybe is showing more signs of development and seeing those kinds of gentrification pressures that we need to come in and get ahead of, and so we can get a reasonable return on our investment for the city? Or, do we have to, you never know what transformative project is going to come along, and I always hate to tie my hands and hate to tie the city's hands more appropriately, because, this is something that's going to last for, if we have someone making these payments, if we are getting these payments in our market-ready neighborhoods, they're going to be payments that are going to come for a period of 15 years. We don't know how the city's going to change over the next 15 years. And so putting in somewhat arbitrary lines, whether it's a zip code or whether it's an abatement area as we have it drawn, or whether it's a census tract, those lines are, at the end of the day, somewhat arbitrary, and determining which arbitrary line we're going to use is a really important decision.
Thank you, President Pro Tem Stenziano. Thank you. Well, before moving on to our public comment, I would like to ask my colleagues if there are any more questions. Well, thank you all so much to my colleagues for, again, just really looking over this legislation, for the work that you put into it as the chair, Councilmember Brown of Economic Development for the past 2 years, and just really making sure that once we present this before our full body, which will be on first reading today, second reading at our next meeting, that we have really been concerted and thoughtful in our decision making and any amendments that we propose. Yes, Councilmember Tyson.
Thank you, Chairwoman Page, and to Chairwoman Brown. I've just been kind of listening, but and I do appreciate all the work you've done, Director Shoney and your team, and you're working on this for a long time. And our goal is obviously to make sure that our commercial, industrial, and also, of course, we have on our residential development, that we're having the right tax incentives for those areas, which is important. And so I appreciate the work that's been done. I think that a lot of people are certainly concerned about residential because of knowing that the number of housing units that we need to be in our community that are affordable. And so here we're looking probably at more, I know this is called affordable housing, workforce housing, market rate housing, these titles. And so thinking about the units that we're looking at as affordable in these and within the residential development, would you say that it's pretty much more around workforce? It's more workforce housing, correct? Workforce.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And so I think that we have to be really clear about that part, because I think that when people hear the word affordable, that they think that hopefully we're going to be, I should step back. We're not going to be able, even with these incentives, to give us all the housing, affordable housing that we need in this community. That's just not going to happen. But what we can do is to make sure that we're having mixed-use housing in our communities, market rate housing and workforce housing. And so even with that, I think what will come up is this topic, as we keep talking about, is gentrification, because no matter what happens, as you're improving these neighborhoods, that unless, we own the land, that we see the taxes going up, utilities going up. And so I just want to make sure that as we're having the workforce housing, that we're thinking about those neighborhoods. I do appreciate you also mentioned that these dollars can be used for rehab, which is great in our neighborhoods. But we've got to continue to figure that part out, because we don't want to have people not being able to live in those neighborhoods. And I think people are afraid of that issue.
Thank you for the, if I may, thank you for the comments. And that's why this is not the only thing we're working really hard with the Central Ohio Community Improvement Corporation, COSIC, better known as the County Land Bank, on setting up a land trust. When I talked earlier about the need to preserve and improve the affordable housing that exists, that's what I'm talking. That's really your biggest bulwark against gentrification, is making sure that those houses and those properties that have been affordable for years and generations remain that way. And some of that is, frankly, finding ways to get into the chain of title, and that's really where the land trust comes in. And so you have to have a multi-pronged strategy, and that's what we're trying to do. That's the approach we're trying to take. The partnerships we've developed with Nationwide Children's and Community Development for All People, and the mayor's commitment to helping them, that's exactly what they're doing. And we have a program that works, and so we're going to continue investing in it and looking for ways to replicate it.
Yes, certainly I was at the press conference on Friday, and certainly the mayor committed some additional dollars at that meeting, and I'm sure that we'll figure a way to work that out. But that's the kind of a partnership that is impressive, to be able to have $20 million focused on affordable housing, an additional $5 million now, but $25 million for that. And so I commend you and your team for that work. But that's exactly what we're talking about. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Tyson. And now we will open up our hearing for public comment. And our first speaker this evening is Kathleen, and I am not sure how to pronounce your last name, Gemeiner. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon, and you have 3 minutes, and welcome to City Hall.
First, I want to commend the City Council, of course, the Mayor's Office, for taking on this very difficult topic and trying to do something to make housing more affordable in Columbus. When I read the proposal, I had some questions, and listening today, one of them was answered, but most of them I still have questions about, so these may be more questions than they really are comments. But I have not seen where we really define what a mixed income neighborhood is. And the conversation I heard suggests that it's somewhere around the 80% of area median income. I'm not sure if I understand that correctly, but to be truly mixed income, it would really need to get down to where a lot of people are, which is at 50% of median income or 40% of median income. So that's a concern that I have, and I'm not sure that this proposal really will go very far to address those needs. There's also in the proposal, there are certain criteria that define whether an area is considered ready to occupy, and these various categories that then determine whether or not a certain kind of exemption can be obtained. And in the proposal, as I saw it posted, it doesn't really define the category. So it says poverty rate or vacancy rate, but it doesn't say poverty rate of what or vacancy rate of what. So I really think if the proposed ordinance is going to be applied fairly and understandably across the city, that those categories need more definition. And I guess the final concern I have is that when we say affordable, really affordable for whom? I mean, I think that's really the question, and I haven't seen affordable defined in the ordinance, and I think we should, I would ask council to do that. Now, for example, I read an article, and it was just, I know, referenced here, I think by Director Shoney a minute ago, that I think it was on Friday's Dispatch, about the proposed project that's going to be built by Nationwide Children's Hospital and Community Development for All People. And the Community Outreach Director Mingo identified what the rents would be, and she said for a 2-bedroom, it would be $630 a month, and a 3-bedroom, it would be $810 a month. So that's what they're considering affordable, but that's not affordable for many, many, many of the people who live on the south side and the Near East Side and the west side and the Linden area. For example, just as an example, a mother of 3 children, she's the only income earner, working full-time, earning $10 an hour, who would need to rent a 3-bedroom home because she has children who are, well, there's 3 children and they're not all of one sex. She would need to spend $810 a month, but that would exceed her affordability limit by almost $300, assuming that affordable means 30% of your income. And that's been the traditional definition that the federal government and has been bought into for years and decades of housing policy. So I'm just really interested in hearing more about the real question on affordability and how we're going to make sure that when we call it affordable, it's really affordable. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'll stay here if any of you have any questions.
Yes. Are there any questions or comments from my colleagues? Director?
So thanks for your questions, and they're really good questions. And I'm going to, for lack of a better term, kind of geek out for a minute and dive into some of this. So you got to start a couple things. One is you start off with what's the definition of a mixed income neighborhood. Mm-hmm. And the way we look at it, it really is something that what we haven't defined it for real purposes, but let's say it's a neighborhood that encompasses, really 60 to 70% of the income spectrum in our community as a whole. So it's not just at the bottom end, but it's making sure you've got at the top end too, because it's, you'll hear discussions about concentration of poverty, and we don't want that. We don't want to just simply build affordable, deeply affordable housing in neighborhoods. The second point that I would make kind of in your questions, well, and you asked about data definitions. Happy to get that for you and run through that with you. I'm not sure where the confusion was, but when we're talking about the poverty rate in an area, we're talking about in those specific mapped areas as we have them defined today.
But the ordinance doesn't define what poverty rate. So it says when you decide if a neighborhood is I'm forgetting the categories now.
Let's call it ready for opportunity.
Okay, ready. Yeah, it says you look at vacancy rate, you look at poverty rate, but it doesn't say if X number are below X part of X percent of poverty. So
the comparison is to the city's poverty rate as a whole. So is the area outperforming the city or underperforming the city as a whole? All 226 square miles of the city. So that's the standard, that's the bar that we're using.
It might be good to have it in the ordinance.
I think it is, but, and then finally, the fundamental question comes back to, really are we pushing the poverty rates or the affordability rates enough? And part of our analysis was to figure out how much the abatement's really worth. Because you can't say, well, we want to have the abatement, in exchange for the abatement, we feel like you need to provide housing that's affordable to folks making 30% of area median income, which, gosh, I think would take you down to, a household making probably $15,000, $20,000 a year. The abatement's just not worth that much. When you compare what it costs to build a project and how much the abatement's worth versus what you can earn in rent, it's just not worth that much. What we looked at with the analysis with the consultants and kind of tested this in the market was, how much is the abatement worth on a per unit affordability basis? And what we found was we thought we could probably get that 80 to 100% of area median income affordability. And then we have to layer that with other programs. So this isn't the only program we have. We layer, our plan is to layer the affordability that we can achieve, that we can buy with the abatement, with other programs like federal housing tax credits, with city capital dollars, with community development block grant dollars. So we'll get down to 80% with one set of tools, and then we got to use another set of tools to get from 80% down to 50% or 60% of AMI.
And I guess what I would just urge all of you to do would be then to, since this won't go below 80% of poverty, then to tie it into the other things that exist and actually incorporate them into the ordinance so that we don't do one thing and say, well, we'll have to do other things, but we don't really know how much money we have for all these other things. I think if we're really going to talk affordable housing, and I do think that you've done a great job of taking a first step here, but I think we've really got to put a package together that's a promise to the people that it is affordable, not just affordable for people that are at the 100%, 80% median income.
Councilmember Elizabeth Brown.
I just want to add that I really appreciate your comments, and I echo the director's appreciation of it. And one thing that this is a pretty big change for the city, this policy, and we've been deliberative about it, and we've had a lot of public hearings, so there's been a ton of attention on it. And one thing I know many folks, especially the people I talk to in the affordable housing sector, always remind me, and that I try to also remind others, is that this is just one tool. This is really one piece of an overall effort that's not just public sector, but civic and in some cases private sector as well. So for example, in our capital budget this year, we gave a substantial amount of money to the Affordable Housing Alliance to start their overall, and I know that Councilmember Tyson and Councilmember Page really championed that, to invest in their citywide approach to affordable housing at all levels of the spectrum. So with whatever tool we have in this sort of slice of the world, which is abatements, we are trying to find the tools, or we are trying to find the goals that we can actually pay for by using this tool, if that makes sense. So I just want to remind folks listening that I will speak for my colleagues, we're all very aware this is one piece, and to truly achieve affordability for the mother of three who's making $10 an hour, there's so many more pieces, and we've got a lot to do, but others in the community have a lot to do, and they're doing it too, and it's ongoing.
And I think it would be really helpful too if there were, and if there is, please let me know, but if there were a report that came out from City Council on an annual basis that actually showed the number of affordable units in various segments, as like the map that's in here, that would actually show affordable and affordable at what level. So if, I don't know if thought has gone into doing that, or in the Department of Development to doing that, and if something exists, I'm happy, give me a website, I'll go look at it. But I really don't think we, have a good sense of how many units are affordable. I mean, I rent out a house I used to live in, and I went online just kind of looking at rentals to see, am I charging about what I should be charging? And it was all over the place. I just couldn't believe that people were trying to get $1,000 out of apartment on the west side of Parsons. I mean, it's just, people are struggling, really struggling to find a place to live. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. Thank you for coming down. Councilmember Tyson.
Thank you. And certainly, Kathleen, thank you for coming. And I know that Bobby Garber is in the audience today. And certainly, there is a difference between, we're talking about affordable housing, as we were saying, I'm just using affordable market rate as well as workforce. And this is pretty much around workforce housing. That's what this is. And so, as Bobby will share, I think there are about 4 goals that are looking at other affordable housing as recommendations or tools that we need to look at. And certainly one that's not included in this legislation is, again, how do we enhance people's incomes to be able to, not to be able to have, to live in affordable housing. And so that's something that I think this council is certainly looking at as to what we can do to enhance that. Because at the end of the day, it's about how do people make more money to be able to live in these neighborhoods, in our neighborhoods, and what do we need to do? So I thank you for your comments. I don't want you to think that we're not thinking about it, because we absolutely are thinking about this. And we're going to have to do some out-of-the-box initiatives to be able to work on this issue. And I think that Bobby certainly has a lot of numbers. If you haven't spoken with her, you've seen all the information that she has. And we have also, we're very committed to trying to make sure that people have a, decent, affordable housing to live in, that, so you have our commitment to that. Thanks.
Our next speaker this afternoon is Betty Janes. Ms. Janes, welcome to City Council. And as she's coming to the podium, I would like to just go over some of the legislation briefly. And I'm referring specifically to the definition section, which goes over the 6 criteria that will be used in order to determine, or that have been used in order to determine what neighborhood goes into which category, and there are 3. And in each of those is population growth, median household income growth, poverty rate, growth in median rent, housing vacancy rate, and the mortgage foreclosure rate. All of those independently will be measured against the rates for the city as a whole. So, and looking at the mortgage foreclosure rate, it says that an area meets this distress criterion if the mortgage foreclosure rate is above the mortgage foreclosure rate for the city of Columbus. And again, that applies for all of the other 5 criterion, including the poverty rate. Ms. Betty, the floor is now yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, council members. My name is Betty Janes. I am president of the Westgate Neighbors Association and a 37-year resident of the Hilltop. So while we appreciate the city's effort towards citywide investment to promote inclusive growth, we do not believe all areas are going to benefit equally. In fact, due to the current housing policy, we believe the Hilltop will continue to see primarily new rentals at the 50 to 60% AMI range. If nothing else changes, our dismal ranking of economic segregation, as actually cited in your own HR&A final report, is never going to improve. It's the mantra I continue to speak. We cannot continue to concentrate poverty and hopelessness in pockets of the city. Persistently disinvested is how we feel and what the numbers show. As I mentioned last month, we cannot confuse affordable housing with low-income housing. While Homes on the Hill, our CDC, focused solely on low-income housing, is very good at using OFA and LIHTC funding for low-income rental housing, unless they are allowed to change their business model, we will not see the type of development that drives home ownership and true neighborhood revitalization. With so many parcels in the land bank, and with these new incentives, my question is, who is going to help connect the developers with willing first-time home buyers? We also know that West Broad Street being one of the mobility corridors for Insight 2050 and so much zero setback properties, the Hilltop could see a type of revitalization we've seen in other areas. But without a CDC focused on economic development, we lack the expertise to connect the key players. Many of our all-volunteer organizations have attempted to drive economic development. But we simply don't have the bandwidth, the expertise, or the access to the resources of a true CDC. So I'd like to continue this discussion offline to see what needs to be true to form a CDC that will begin to work, do the work required to truly make the Hilltop thrive. We don't have a CDC for economic development. The other concern I have is the inclusion of the option for the developers in the market-ready area to buy out. I understand that the Department of Development does not anticipate it being used, and I would submit one way to guarantee that is to close the loophole completely. Allowing developers to buy out is contrary to the spirit of this legislation and will divert valuable tax incentives from previously neglected area. Increasing the buyout is not the answer. Closing the loophole is. Let's invest these valuable tax incentives in the persistently disinvested areas and level the playing field. Lastly, while mixed-income neighborhoods is the goal, I would submit we also need to ensure multi-generational households or neighborhoods. Mayor Ginther at Tuesday's press conference said we must allow our seniors to age in place. For this to happen, we need to think about what needs to be done to make sure they're not driven out of their homes by ever-increasing property values and property tax bills. I have reached out to State Representative Adam Miller. I'll be meeting with him next week, and Franklin County Auditor, and would like to continue the conversation at the local level to begin work now before another senior is forced out of our older neighborhoods. So the goal must not only be mixed income, but multi-generational neighborhoods. Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming down. Are there any questions or comments? Again, thank you for the concerns that you've raised. I know we talked about it at our community meeting as well, and truly appreciate your feedback.
Thank you. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Joe Motil. Welcome to council, Mr. Motil, and again, you have 3 minutes.
Put my glasses on. President Hardin, pro tem Cinciano, members of City Council. Although your intentions are well taken, this legislation on the affordable housing crisis in Columbus really should have been taken up no less than a decade ago. Mayor Ginther was a member of City Council in 2007 and its president in 2011, and really was he so blind not to see the need to address this crisis when serving in such a high leadership position. And while poverty has risen 68% since 2001, really the city's turned its back on the low to moderate income housing situation and really taken the easy road while signing off on one tax abatement after another to the rich and powerful who actually control the economic and development policies of the city. Reports indicate that in Central Ohio, for every 100 extremely low income households that require housing, there are only 31 affordable units that exist. So, and along with that you got developers that tear down perfectly affordable apartments and replace them with high-end rent apartments like the Grand Oaks project in the Discovery District, which actually exacerbates our affordable housing problem. And no doubt the mayor and the city council will reward the Pizzuti companies by handing them a nice fat tax abatement for dismantling of affordable housing in the district. And I'm not going to stand here and say this proposed policy is really better than nothing, because I'm sorry, it's not. We need to address the housing crisis with policies that are less of a burden on the taxpayers while reducing the excessive profits, risk-free development practices, and taxpayer subsidies that City Hall provides the development community and corporate Columbus on a regular basis. This report was originally conducted to look at tax incentives and in particular tax abatements that are offered to developers. And these proposed recommendations from this report are really more disguised to look like an affordable housing policy, but it reads more like a revised tax abatement playbook that is designed to more easily explain the continuation of unnecessary tax abatements for developers where they're no longer needed. For instance, you continue a 100% tax abatement in the Short North and market-ready neighborhoods, and that's just outrageous and unwarranted. The Short North is not a distressed and blighted neighborhood. Tax abatements for this neighborhood and some other areas of Columbus will merely fuel gentrification. And the affordable housing credits that you're offering for creating office space and the affordability requirement conditions, as the lady said before, they just need to be eliminated. The 20% total number of affordable units need to be mandated, period. No financial penalties, no opting out. Because if you don't mandate the requirements, I suspect City Hall and the mayor will merely substantially increase its tax abatement amount to help the developer offset any type of monetary penalty. And if you do not mandate these 20% total requirements, you're going to continue to increase housing segregation in our area that is already ranks us as one of the worst in the United States. And that's what we're trying to accomplish, to eliminate that. So in closing, in terms of your development business policy, that's it, part of this plan. You claim you will not provide incentives for companies paying less than an average $15 an hour wage. It should instead read a living wage of $15 an hour and not an average. And that's because our mayor and council have never said no to granting a tax abatement to Fortune 500 companies and other rich corporations and institutions. So we can at least see to it that you're going to pay their employees a decent wage in exchange for your taxpayer subsidies. So no average, $15 an hour, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Motel. Any questions or comments? Councilmember
We
Elizabeth
covered
Brown.
this at the last hearing too, but it's not an average. We don't do the job has to pay at least 15. It's not an average.
Well, the language I read said that.
Well,
Yeah, so
I don't know what language you're reading, but we haven't had it on the agenda yet, so when it's codified, yeah, it's for, no job can pay less than that. It's not an average, yes.
And our final speaker this evening is Mr. Calvin Hairston. Welcome to council, Mr. Hairston, and you have 3 minutes. Welcome to council, Mr. Hairston. You may begin.
Council President Harden, Pro Temp Stendiana, members of council. I oftentimes think of the Near East Side as a beacon of Black history, and I think of the East Side because I'm bringing before you, and I submitted a packet to you that tells a story about a family out of the hills of West Virginia struggled and paid for a piece of property that I have advocated saving. But that advocacy has failed on deaf ears. It's a historical piece of property, 1870 is the history. It really was, when I found the history, was one of the first Kroger stores on Main Street. Under the NSP funding stimulus packet, we applied for using the Columbus Compact as the developer funds to do that property. It was turned down because my brother, a Columbus police officer of 35 years, they felt, Boyce Safford said, you are an employee of the city, and because you are an employee of the city, it creates a conflict of interest. To address conflict of interest, I asked my daughter, a 15-year employee of CMHA, look at the guidelines and tell me, what are the guidelines governing NSP funding for this project? My baby says to me, Daddy, what guidelines are they reading? NSP is a federal stimulus package whereby the city of Columbus is the administrator. Uncle John does not work for the federal government. He works for the city of Columbus. There is no conflict of interest. So my question to you, now, it's kind of a moot point for me to be down here advocating for something that, as of last month, he got frustrated and sold the property. When that happened, what it told me, all the advocacy and all the efforts of me preserving Black history went down the tubes. So I'm here to tell you, for all the advocacy and all the preservation everybody is putting forth to save our community, people are the ultimate benefactors of preserving and providing stimulus. So I felt that my council disappointed me.
Thank you, Mr. Harrison, for coming down, and we truly do appreciate your comments. Again, Mr. Harrison was our final speaker, and that concludes our public hearing this afternoon. I would like to ask my colleagues if there are any final comments. Seeing none, I would like to thank all of our staffs who worked together to help put this hearing on, Andrew Dyer with LRO as well as CTV for being here. And I thank you all who attended and just for your passion and concern for the individual neighborhoods that you live in, but our city as a whole. And then to thank Director Shoney, who is back with us from Honduras, as well as his team who's back in the back, Hannah. We have Deputy Director Harris, as well as I see Rita Paris, who too are all very concerned and passionate about affordable housing, how we define affordable housing, but ultimately ensuring that every individual in the city of Columbus has a safe, decent, and affordable place to live. Thank you all so much, and we'll see you at 5 o'clock.